Prime Minister Mark Carney is on his first official trip to meet the leaders of the United Kingdom and France. But with an impending election at home, the leader of the opposition still found a way to change the subject to carbon taxes. Carney has ordered that the consumer carbon tax be nullified in April. Today, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said for the first time that he'll kill the industrial carbon tax as well.
These taxes drive up the cost of the entire domestic steel industry. This was a bad idea before the Trump tariffs. But now that Trump is hitting Canadian industry with a massive tariff, Carney is saying that he will impose a massive carbon tax on Canadian businesses. The combination of Trump's tariffs and Carney's carbon taxes would be a disaster for the workers behind me.
So the Liberals stand behind the industrial price despite this move from the opposition. Anita Anand is the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, and she joins me now live in the studio. Minister, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you too.
You heard what Pierre Poilievre said there, that this is hurting industry. Will the Liberals stick with the industrial price? It's been a centerpiece of your plan to this point.
We recognize that climate change is a reality, unlike the opposition, and so we are going to ensure that we have a policy that responds to climate change, but also responds to the economic tension and climate that we find ourselves in. That's why I've been on the phone all weekend with members of the steel and aluminum industry to ensure that they know that the Government of Canada has their backs. I issued a letter this morning encouraging every recipient of Government of Canada funding to buy Canadian, to supply Canadian, to hire Canadian. We need to do whatever it takes to ensure that the steel and aluminum industry, not to mention all other Canadian economic sectors, remain viable, stable, and strong through this difficult time.
Do you think, though, the industrial carbon price, which I know is lower on a percentage basis than the consumer one, which you're getting rid of, is that sustainable through a potential trade war with the United States that targets steel, for example, and aluminum?
The policies that we have now are going to be fully responsive to the tension that we are hearing and feeling from the United States. And our policies actually respond to the needs of the industry. For example, when I was speaking with them over the weekend, they have concerns about their workforce. We are there with supports for workers. They have concerns about ports. We are there considering what more we can do to protect the steel and aluminum industry in terms of other product coming in from foreign suppliers so that our markets aren't flooded. We're actually taking a targeted response to what the industry is telling us, David, and that's what a responsible government should do rather than bandying about slogans.
You've sent in your letter, you've asked them, urged them to buy Canadian steel and Canadian aluminum. Some of the unions are saying this should be required for any kind of a public project from the Government of Canada. What about going that far?
I actually have a meeting with additional stakeholders tomorrow, and all options are on the table. I will say this was my first letter issued under a new portfolio after meeting with my Deputy Minister 10 minutes after I was sworn in, but all options are on the table to protect Canadian industry, Canadian workers, and the Canadian supply chain. You know, internal trade was a portfolio that I was heavily involved in. We need to add $200 billion to the Canadian economy without going through Donald Trump. That means protecting Canadian industry. That means bringing down barriers to trade as well.
In eliminating the consumer carbon price, or at least reducing it to zero on April 1 through this order in council that was posted over the weekend, that is an instrument in the federal government's climate plan that estimates say it's responsible for between 8 and 14% of the emissions reductions. How do you fill that gap now? Because that is, while not the lion's share, it is a significant share.
Well, thank you for recognizing that climate change and climate change policy are important pillars of the Liberal government's overall stance. And we do want to and intend to get to net zero by 2050. So what we are doing now is developing additional policy tools that will enable us to reach net zero by 2050. We had to do what Canadian consumers were asking, which was this particular price on pollution not being popular will be replaced with other mechanisms.
Right, but how do you do that? It's another 8 to 14%. The consensus across economists, and this was cited by your government many times, that this was the cheapest fairest way to do it. By every metric, it was reducing emissions and putting money in the pockets of lower income Canadians. But it failed the metric of popularity. So now you have to choose an option that is not as effective and probably more expensive in the long run.
We have to be responsive to circumstances that Canadian consumers themselves are feeling in their pocketbooks. And one of those circumstances was that the price on pollution was hitting them extremely hard. And so we will develop the policy proposal that meets the needs of Canadian consumers, while also recognizing that climate change is a reality, something that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives still haven't done. While they want to remove the industrial price on pollution as well as the consumer price on pollution, they really need to tell Canadians whether they believe that climate change is something that needs to be addressed. And across the country, the Canadian public is waiting for that particular statement.
But
yet to be heard.
On a dollar out, dollar in basis, though, I mean, I've listened to your government defend the math on the rebate, right? And the fights with the PBO's analysis and then the correction from the PBO over time as it separated out the industrial price, which is an issue today. 80% of Canadian households on a straight cash in, cash out basis were better off with the tax and the rebate. And now the country, because of the politics of the country, quite frankly, if we're going to hit those targets, have to move to something that will be more costly for the country.
So the price on pollution was divisive, and we're at a moment in time where we as a party, we as a government want to be a uniting force for our country. We want to ensure that business, Canadians, workers across the board know that we are here together to fight this tariff war against the United States. And when you have a policy as divisive as that one was, it is very difficult to ensure that unification, that collaboration. Let me tell you that in my work with the provinces and territories, in my work with unions and with business, large and small, there is a feeling like no other that we will stand up for Canada and Canadian sovereignty together, and we need policies that unite us, and that's exactly what this government stands for.
You mentioned trade earlier, the need to add $200 billion to the Canadian economy without going to through the United States. I know internal trade is a big focus of that, but so is external trade, the Prime Minister in France and the United Kingdom. There's about to be carbon border adjustments on the European Union in January of 2026 and the UK in January of 2027. So you pay a tariff if you send a good there that comes from a place without carbon pricing. Can you reasonably expand trade with those allies if there is no industrial price in Canada? That seems a consequence of what was put on the table today.
Well, that's an excellent point, and I appreciate the focus on external supply chains. Let's just say right now we depend on the United States for 80% of our trade. We are the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. And what we need to do, and what Prime Minister Carney is doing right now, is ensuring that Canada's leveraging those relationships, those trade relationships, so that we engage in diversification of supply chains. That will benefit the Canadian economy, that will benefit Canadian suppliers, and Canadian resilience economically overall.
So the Prime Minister is in the United Kingdom right now. He had a news conference a little while ago, and he was asked about the value of the assets that he's put into the blind trust. Now, up front, he has complied with the letter of the law in advance of the deadline, but there is no public summary available right now with an election very likely coming, so that people can assess whether there is a conflict, even a summary or a detailed breakdown. He was asked about that today at the press conference. Just want to play this answer and get your response on the other side. Let's have a listen.
In your assets, it's very difficult to believe.
Look inside yourself, Rosemary. I mean, you start from a prior of conflict and ill will. I have served in the private sector. I have stood up for Canada. I have left my roles in the private sector at a time of crisis for our country. I'm complying with all the rules. Your line of questioning is trying to invent new rules. I'm complying with the rules.
This is going to be an election issue. The Conservatives are making this a core attack on the Prime Minister. Does he need to take an extra step here just to lay things on the table in a way to put away any doubt about where he stands?
He established a blind trust 120 days before he was required to do so. That shows proactivity on his part. I think the question that he posed to the Leader of the Opposition is fair. Why can't you go and get a security clearance when Prime Minister Carney was able to do that in 2 weeks, when we are dealing with potential foreign interference, when we are dealing with national security issues? So I would say 120 days in advance of having to file that information and set up that blind trust, that is important. What about the security clearance on behalf of the Leader of the Opposition?
Well, Mr. Poilievre, as you know, says he doesn't want to be gagged by anything he sees. He wants to be able to talk about it. That's his answer, that he lays out there. And I appreciate that Mr. Carney has gone ahead of the deadline. He's got turned in his work early. But, if the Ethics Commissioner doesn't provide any kind of a summary until 120 days from now or even 60 days from now, that could be after an election. If there's no sign of disclosure from the Ethics Commissioner, would it be incumbent on the Prime Minister to maybe proactively do it like he's done here so that Canadians can judge it before they vote?
So what's incumbent upon the Prime Minister, as well as every other elected representative, is to comply with legal obligations. The Prime Minister is, in fact, doing that and going above and beyond with proactive disclosure. And I would say that is the way in which we should be analyzing the disclosure that public servants across the board make. Are they complying with the law? And in this case, the answer is yes.
Are you worried, though, this is going to be an issue in the campaign? Because, you saw that answer there, and the Conservatives will look at this and say, what is he hiding? He's not coming clean, and make it a core attack on the new leader.
David, my worry is the economic resilience of our country and supporting Canadian workers and Canadian businesses during this very difficult time. That's why I will, as Minister of Industry, ensuring that we are supporting industry and workers. That's why I'm meeting with them. That's why I issued the letter relating to buying Canadian, supplying Canadian, and hiring Canadian. And that's my focus as Minister and MP.
Beyond the letter, which I appreciate, encourage them to try to buy more of this, can we expect any more action in the medium term? Because every indication, Ministers, is probably going to be an election call by Sunday, because Parliament is supposed to come back on the 24th, and that seems very unlikely to happen at this point in time. Do you think there's hundreds of people who have lost their jobs in the steel sector, for example? Might there be supports beyond, say, the job sharing options and different things that we've seen from Minister McKinnon in the days leading up to this?
You are going to see as much action as I can possibly fit in the next 5, 6, 7 days. What does that mean? Including supporting industry. It means ensuring that I'm reviewing transactions that are coming before the Canadian public, such as the Glencore transaction. That means ensuring that we have the supports for businesses as well as the conditions for entry at our ports. Those are 4 major areas right there, David, that I'm working on and that I had in front of me today.
Okay, 5, 6, 7 days. That we agree then we're probably going to have an election before the House comes back on Monday. It sounds like that's where your head is, Minister.
My head is ensuring that I do whatever possible for the Canadian economy in the time that I have. I do not know any dates relating to elections, but I do know that I have my work cut out for me.
Right. And do you think the Prime Minister does intend to seek a mandate very soon? I know he is legitimately the Prime Minister. This is the system. But he does not have a seat. And that is a problem for, the basic functions of a parliamentary government. So a mandate very quickly?
The Prime Minister is committed to the electoral process. I know the Prime Minister would like to have a seat in the House of Commons, and we very much would like to see him sitting there with us as the Prime Minister of this country sitting in the House of Commons. So we very much look forward to supporting him wherever he chooses to run.
Minister Anita Anand, always appreciate the time. Like when you come in the studio. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.